In this video, I want to begin a systematic linear reading of Badiou's The Imminence of Truths, which came out in French in 2018 and will be coming out in English in February of 2022. So in fact, my whole project for this hyperbook and beginning with a hyper reading of Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man came from the preliminary idea or project of wanting to prepare myself for the publication in English of Badiou's new book. So I took a leap into the past because I recalled that Badiou in the 80s, in the beginning of the 80s, in 1981, with the principle of minority, set out to give meaning and overriding importance to the idea of the absolute as a way of saving multiplicities from their relative status in the world of relativism as relative multiplicities, and give a new consistency to the notion of multiplicities in reinserting them in the one or the absolute. And so to come up with a notion of a coherent concept of absolute multiplicities. And then in the second book, in 1985, A Biography of Ordinary Man, Laruelle begins with, at first he calls it the real, the one, the individual as equal to multiplicities or minorities. And it's only a little later, in part 2 of the introduction, that he identifies that with the absolute. But that's the idea behind it all. Begin with the absolute and then describe the relative world from the point of view of the absolute, or from the point of view of having positing the concept and its validity and the language of the absolute. So this is very similar to the step that Badiou takes in The Imminence of Truths, where after describing existence and appearing in the relative worlds that he does in Logics of Worlds, Badiou decides to take up the point of view of the absolute, to which he has to give meaning and substance, and to examine what the relative worlds look like from that point of view, and how from these relative worlds a truth or truths, an absolute, can arise in the local and have the characteristics of the absolute as absolute, as universal, eternal, and nonetheless singular. We talked about, in relation to Laruelle, how there's often in philosophy of science a notion of a layer cake model for the content of our scientific, or in this case speculative, language. So one traditional idea that's more usually in the empiricist tradition is that there's a sort of given base language, which is the language of observation, and any new language must be compatible with this base language that doesn't change, and there's a sort of seeping up effect as opposed to the trickle down effect. There's a seeping up effect where the observation language gives meaning and content to any new speculative language that comes along. That's one vision of things. And another vision, which is quite prominent in post-Newtonian physics, is, as in relativity and in quantum theory and in more recent theories, you begin with your speculative language, you begin with an incommensurable leap, and you use the new concepts and the new language to reinterpret everything, all the auxiliary steps, including the base language, the language of so-called observation, which will be discovered from that point of view and by that practice of being contaminated with dogmatic presuppositions, prejudices, ideological assumptions, and so on. Badiou attempts or comes up with a different procedure. That is to say, Badiou does put forward in this book a new speculative language. He could have, according to what I understand, he could have directly developed his speculative language and then looked at how the concrete specific practices in the world and their capacity to generate truths, how they appear from the point of view of this language of the absolute and language of the infinite in its speculative language form that Badiou will be developing in the book. I think he abandoned that way of beginning at the top and then reinterpreting all the lower levels, partially for pedagogical reasons, but also partially because Badiou has a different picture of this layer cake model that allows us to start with a far more sophisticated observation language, if you will, but it's no longer an observation language, a base language that is not a guarantee of conceptual stasis. So everyone knows the base language that Badiou uses is the language of mathematics, in particular the language of set theory and of transfinite sets. And that's what replaces the idea of an observation language. We have this mathematical language which is not stabilized, which is not traditional. It's not a doxa. It's something that has come up fairly recently and is under intense development. So Badiou can use that as a base language without having to be confronted with the risks of stasis, the impossibility of speculation, of speculative leaps or incommensurable leaps, because in the empiricist model that will be disallowed. in the model where he's using mathematics as his base language, these speculative leaps are not just allowed, but they're standard procedure, if you want. Well, he still has resistance from the mathematicians, because he's going to take that mathematical language, and he's going to, if I use the terms that I took from Laruelle's method, he's going to radicalize, intensify, transvalue, that is to say, in Badiou's term, poetize, in the sense of a poetization that amounts to conceptualization. So that's these operations of, in shorthand, I like to say transvaluation, will be in operation. So Badiou is not a mathematical reductionist. He's not doing mathematics, except when he needs to do mathematics to explain what he's on about. He's doing philosophy, and even all the high-powered mathematical terms and concepts are transvalued to make them a part of philosophical discourse. So that's the distinctiveness of Badiou's method. So we have the imminence of truths, being an event, volume 3. Being an event, volume 3. There's even a little dedication by Badiou for my book. It's 700 pages long, a little more than 700 pages long, where Biography of Ordinary Man is 250 pages long in French. I'm going to just sort of read through, giving the section titles, or the chapter titles and the section titles. The table of contents is available online. I'll put a link to that below or in my blog. You can't just watch the videos. You have to look at my blog, Agent Swarm, from time to time. And in particular, the English translation doesn't follow the same numbering system of the chapters. So I'll discuss that at the moment that Badiou discusses it. So as I don't have a copy of the English translation, a review copy. I did have the review copy beforehand for the Imminence of Truths in French, but I don't have one in English. So I'll be reading from the French, and to make what I say compatible with the book when it comes out, I'll give the chapter and section titles. And maybe I'll do it again after. This is a first draft for a book on the Imminence of Truths, which is one aspect of the hyperbook, which includes my book on a biography of ordinary man. So the first part in the French is called Speculative Strategy. That's I don't think there was a chapter heading. Yes, just before that, it's called the General Introduction. And then part 1 of the General Introduction is Speculative Strategy. So despite wanting to sort of go up gradually to the absolute, and then come down and look at finite practices, Badiou begins, like Laruelle, he begins with the peak idea. So he says that for over 30 years, his philosophical strategy is to establish what he calls the imminence of truths. That is to say, to save the category of truth and to legitimate the fact that a truth can be absolute all the while that is a localized construction, that it can be eternal all the while resulting from a process in a determined world and a process in the world, and so the truth belongs to the time of this world, or the process that generates the truth belongs to the time of the world, whereas the truth is eternal. It's eternal, but it's created. So it's eternal forwards, it's not eternal backwards. It's not a retroactive. A truth, he hasn't put it with a capital T yet, but a truth for Badiou is not is eternal, but not in a retroactive way. It's eternal forwards. So a truth can be absolute without being a absolute while being a localized construction. So he begins with truth, and he begins with the absolute. Remember, Laruelle begins with one of his synonyms for the absolute, but he begins with science. It's only later he talks about truth, and it's in relation to science anyhow. Badiou is already in a more pluralist posture because he begins with truth, not science, and truth is scientific, artistic, political, and of love. So not just science, but aside from that multiplicity of conditions of thinking, and so of what Badiou is still willing to call philosophy, although Laruelle is looking around for another name. The conditions are the absolute, truth, and that philosophy, or the replacement of philosophy, is not a discipline of thought intrinsically related to questions. It's intrinsically related to conditions, whether science for Laruelle or science, love, politics and art for Badiou. So Badiou begins with that peak idea. And the idea is, how can truth as absolute come from a local construction? How can truth as eternal result from a determined process in a determined world, including being determined in time, so historically situated? This idea of eternity, I said that it's a forward-looking eternity, and another idea about this eternity is that in another vocabulary, such as Deleuze's vocabulary, this will be called the untimely and not the eternal. Why is it a synonym for the untimely, because although truths are eternal, they're not universally found in every situation, in every world. They're universally accessible without being universally imposed. So it's not a truth, or truths are not in the form of a constraint, a constitutive constraint in all possible situations. They're eternal in the sense that one, like a resource or a reserve, one can always access them precisely because they're eternal. And in fact, we'll see that no covering procedure of ideology can fully reduce us to mere mundane temporal truths, or in scare quotes there, mere mundane temporal knowledge. Truths are always there as continuities of accessibility. Okay, we've got 4 points. So how he wants to legitimate how truths can be absolute while being local, eternal while being arising in a determinate time. Third, ontologically determined as generic multiplicities while being phenomenologically localized as maximal degree of existence in a given world. So we know phenomenologically is being used here in a Badiousian sense. It's objective phenomenology. It's not subjective phenomenology, which is once again suspect because it's too empiricist. So this idea of generic multiplicities has been imported all through Badiou's evolution from being an event up to now. And the idea is that a generic multiplicity is as free as possible from all known, determinate, constructible predicates. And this is another point of parallel with Laruelle, where the one, the absolute, the individual for him, which equals dispersions and multiplicities, is, he doesn't use the word in A Biography of Ordinary Man, the word generic, that comes in later, but it's the same thing. It's generic. It's a generic multiplicity, and or multiplicities of multiplicities, and not to be identified with what Laruelle calls the anthropological predicates that define knowledge and existence in the world. Fourth, he wants to legitimate that a truth can be asubjective or universal, all the while requiring for it to be seized or apprehended, if you want, a subjective incorporation. So truths are asubjective and universal, but they require subjective fidelity and incorporation Otherwise, they're not truths. They're some sort of abstraction that may constitute knowledge or not, but they're not truth in the strong absolute sense that Badiou wants to defend. And once again, you must avoid the sort of, in fact, mathematicist trap. In other places, Badiou has warned us against the idea of treating the universality of a truth as being that of the universal quantifier. It's not that. Once again, it's a universality of infinite reserve and accessibility, and not of infinite imposition on and constraint on every situation. Badiou continues, one could also say that it's a question of creating the effective possibility of affirming that the truths exist as universal concrete or concrete universal exceptions, which universal concrete exceptions or concrete universal exceptions, both translations are authorized by the French. That expression is in italics. So, as against the universals that define established knowledge, which are abstract universals, the universals that Badiou is appealing to are concrete universals. They're both universal and so trans-world, and so untimely, and they're concrete universals, concrete, and so anchored in determinate worlds and processes. According to Badiou, I wanted to maybe comment the other point. They're exceptions. So in order to get a truth, you have to be open to the exceptions. You have to be willing to say, not all the time, but you have to be at least ready and open to the possibility that something is happening that is not categorizable under the universals in place. So he'll define that later on in terms of covering. So this is sort of like a Kuhnian paradigm that must always either ignore anomalies. Of course, anomalies are coming up in fact all the time, of stronger or weaker importance, but that's to be defined afterwards. Anomalies are always there. Some of them are in fact just sort of accidents or mistakes, so or chance fluctuations, and some of them are perhaps more than that. So there are these exceptions all the time, these anomalies all the time. The normal science approach is to ignore them or cover them over, or by ad hoc procedures of interpretation, explain them away, explain that in some way they are covered by the current paradigm. And another approach, which Kuhn calls the revolutionary science approach, is to use the exceptions as part of the procedure either for generating a new paradigm, or if that new paradigm is generated in another way, for validating that new paradigm. It's generally recognized that while these are very useful categories, there's something too neat in Kuhn, that you're going from normal situation to a short-lived revolutionary situation back to a long normal situation, where in fact there are revolutionary events or possibilities coming up all the time, and there are always alternatives. There's not just one single mono paradigm that rules everything just till somehow people are able to resist and overcome, and after a little chaotic period bring in another big mono paradigm. It's you would never be able to have a revolution if things were structured like that. So in fact, exceptions are omnipresent. Some of them are important and many of them are not. And insofar as these pertain to truths, they're concrete universals. They're not just sort of armchair a priori deductions, and they're not just empirical findings. They're some intrinsically fused hybrid thing that is both at once. And then according to Badiou, this concept of truth, or of truths, allows us to escape Kant's dilemma. And he says that for Kant, either truths are only subjective modalities of judgment, or we have to grant them a sort of transcendence. So the Kantian dilemma or dichotomy is either truths are phenomenal, which will lead to problems of relativism, or they're noumenal and transcendent, which will lead to problems of accessibility, amongst other things. So Badiou says that, well, he's given his conceptual strategy. Then he situates it. The polemical context of this strategy is a struggle on two fronts. First, a radical critique of the onto-theological apparatus, or dispositif, if you like that word transposed into English. The onto-theological apparatus, which has been the accomplice of religions, and which saves truths, because that's Badiou's concern, to save truths in a context where truths, absolute, eternal, universal truths, are radically put into question and by many even rejected in the what it's convenient to call postmodern relativist world that is a huge part of the world we're living in. So one response to that is the I suppose you could say there, the 2,500 year long onto-theological apparatus, which saves truths, but at the price of the absolute transcendence of the one, which subsumes finite multiplicities under the formal authority of the one infinite, or of the infinite one, which is often called God. So here we're faced with a problem that comes from the fact that these thinkers, in particular the ones I'm considering, Laruelle, Deleuze and Badiou, don't have the same vocabulary. And some of the divergences are just lexical, it's just a question of words. And if you learn to translate from one to the other, that need not bother you. And some of these lexical divergences are conceptual ones, important conceptual ones as well. So one has to always consider how much of this divergence is lexical and how much of it is substantial or conceptual. A very good example of that is in Deleuze's long letter, although it's published as an article now, in Deleuze's long letter to Foucault, where Deleuze tries to explain to Foucault that Foucault privileges the word pleasure, and Foucault can't stand the word desire, and so can't stand any problematics, theoretical problematics, which make crucial positive use of desire. And Deleuze is the other way round. He makes a very positive use of a new concept of desire, and he finds that the concept of pleasure is the word and the concept are a way of describing everything that he wants to get away from. Apparently that was a big objection on Foucault's part to Deleuze's theoretical developments. When Foucault started evolving at the end of the 70s maybe and into the 80s, Deleuze writes this very interesting article to try and convince Foucault and to show everyone that what Foucault means by pleasure is the same as, or much more closely associated with, what Deleuze means by desire, and similarly what Foucault calls desire is what Deleuze calls pleasure. This is an effort of translation between theoretical research programs. The very few philosophers of that group are willing to make. Often one will see what substantial resemblances being overlooked, not just by the followers but by the thinkers themselves, because the words used are conflicting and different. So we have to take note of the choice of words, ask what is the motivation for this choice, and wonder, would another choice be possible, and has another choice been conserving most of the same strategies and stakes? Has another choice been made by another philosopher within the sort of meta-research program of French contemporary French philosophy? So Badiou treats the one as necessarily on the side of transcendence and of totality. So the one is on the negative end of the spectrum, away from the positive end, which is the absolute. They're absolutely non-identical. Laruelle makes the opposite choice of vocabulary, and he treats the one and the absolute as synonyms, and in that case, the enemy is still the totality, but in the spectrum between the absolute and the totality, Laruelle prefers to put the one on the absolute side and the word one, and Badiou prefers to put the word one on the side of totality. And not just the word, the definition will be different, of course. So one way of responding to the Kantian dilemma and to the danger of relativism is the onto-theological apparatus that erects a one that is infinite and that has supreme authority over us. So God or some God substitute. Badiou goes on to say, this critique of the onto-theological apparatus supposes that in the wake of Cantor, one separate the infinite from the one. And that's another point of divergence in vocabulary, which I've already mentioned, between Laruelle and Badiou. I'm remarking on this all the while that I'm devoting this second series of readings of a book, of, in this case, The Imminence of Truths, because it's interesting to have a sort of a basic translation kit between the different problematics and programs, instead of just saying, oh, he talks about the one, that's no good, or he talks about the infinite in a positive way, that's no good. We need to be able to translate those terms and to see where the richest conceptual creation lies. So Badiou is starting off just with the infinite and the one, but he's going to radically enrich our concept of the infinite and distinguish different types of infinity and give them transvalued or poetized or philosophical equivalence. So that is what I think is the main advantage of the research program that Badiou is developing in the Imminence of Truths. There is something new conceptually being created, and we may find that in other parts is conservative, or we'll see. But here is something that is really important and that can't be glossed over once it's been created and once it's been perceived. So this critique of onto-theology supposes that in the wake of Cantor, one separates the infinite from the one. So for Badiou, the infinite and the one are not identical, and in posing that everything that is can only be in the form of a multiple without one. So the one is the bad guy for Badiou and the good guy for Laruelle. But in this reformulation, that the good concept is, that is to say, the most rich, the most creative, the freest from onto-theological presuppositions, is the multiple without one. And I would argue that this is very close to Laruelle's preferred concept, which he calls absolute multiplicity, or the multiplicity outside its unitary definition. But here maybe there is a richness in Laruelle's conceptual creation, because he's going to distinguish in 1985 in A Biography of Ordinary Man that which is counted as one, the unitary multiplicity, and that which is an absolute multiplicity, which he calls unary, to distinguish it from unitary, and to give, I think, a notion of concreteness. So once again, under the different terms, we're getting this idea of concrete universal exception in Laruelle, but the path to getting it and some of the terms used to getting it differ from Badiou's. Okay, so Badiou says, okay, we're fighting against onto-theology and we're getting to multiple without one. So, but that's sort of for him over now. Yes, it's important, but it's not the most intense front on the two fronts that he's distinguishing. Given that we have to oppose that, one will not concede that one must disabsolutize all the forms of the multiple that have thus been detached from the one. So let's forget about these divergences on the word one. You have to fight against onto-theology and its projection of totality and identification of the totality with the one and the infinite and all the maximally valued terms. So one has to fight against that, but that does not mean that we should follow the postmodern path of radical disabsolutization, because that's the path to relativism. We need to maintain a different sort of absolute. He says we will not sacrifice the absolute of truths in favor of relativism, a relativism that is most often linguistic or cultural, and whose skepticism, which is its essence. So he's saying the essence of relativism is skepticism. Well, I could have said it the other way around. He's going fast here, but maybe he'll justify that, or maybe he thinks it's obvious. So the essence of relativism is skepticism, I suppose, because skepticism denies the existence of robust truths in the sense of absolute, eternal, universal, and asubjective truths. So we're not going to sacrifice the absolute of truths in favor of relativism, whose skepticism, which is its essence, hides behind a sort of democratism, a vague whose essence is skepticism, which hides behind a sort of vague democratism of knowledge and of action. So this is getting into the territory that Badiou covered in the at the beginning of Logics of Worlds, democratic materialism, the democracy of languages and bodies, and nothing else, no truths. So we know that not in a biography of Ordinary Man, but later Laruelle defends an idea of a democracy of truths. I don't know if Badiou was thinking of that or has even read it or been influenced, even moved, maybe is a better word, to criticize it. But I think this democratism is behind what superficial use some Laruellians make of the notion of a democracy of truths, where that's not even in rupture with the ordinary doxa or the common ideology. There is this idea that one opinion is just as good as any other, that my opinion as a sort of corona skeptic, for example, is just as valid as a doctor talking about the coronavirus, and that I want to call into question for dubious epistemological or conspiracy theory reasons, or the other way around. As a society, dissident voices. So Badiou warns us against vague democratism, and Laruelle, in a biography of Ordinary Man, warns us against cheap mathematization. But in either case, I don't think there, at least in those concepts, the one is warning us against the other. It's clear with all the substantial mathematical content in this book that Badiou is far from indulging in cheap mathematization, and it's clear that in Laruelle's biography of Ordinary Man, his concern with the absolute and with absolute multiplicities, and his critique of Greco-unitary predicates, that Laruelle is not indulging in vague democratism. So for the moment, there's room for a fruitful dialogue between the two.